Okay, so picture this. There's this guy, Elijah, right? Just an ordinary man, but God gives him this crazy assignment that's way bigger than anything he's ever faced. We're talking droughts, miracles, and even bringing a kid back to life. And honestly, the way he navigates all of it, it's wild. You're going to see lessons about trusting God, stepping out even when it's scary, and how obedience can literally change everything. So hang tight, because this story is full of surprises and wow moments. Alright, so let's set the scene here because, honestly, you need to understand the backdrop to really get why everything that happens with Elijah is such a big deal. And we're in the northern kingdom of Israel, around the time of 1 Kings 17 and 18. Now, Israel isn't just one united nation at this point. Nope, it's split, kind of like a family feud, but with crowns and armies. On one side, you've got the northern kingdom, Israel, and on the other, the southern kingdom, Judah. Think of it as two halves of a country, each with their own king, their own capital, Samaria in the north, Jerusalem in the south, and, well, their own problems. And yes, the problems in the north are about to get a lot bigger. So let's zoom in on the northern kingdom for a moment. The king at the time is Ahab, who is introduced at the very end of chapter 16. He's the 7th king of Israel, which, fun fact, makes him kind of a seasoned ruler by now. But don't get too impressed, because Ahab, not exactly winning any awards for righteousness. The Bible says it straight up, he did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than all the kings before him. And, okay, let's be honest, that's saying something because the north already had a reputation for idolatry and bad choices. Ahab basically takes the crown and decides, let's see how far we can push this. And then there's Jezebel. Jezebel, if you've heard the name before, it's probably because she's notorious and not for anything good. Ahab marries her. And suddenly, things get even messier. Jezebel isn't even from Israel. She's Sidonian, from a city called Sidon, which is in modern-day Lebanon, right along the Mediterranean coast. Her father, Ethbaal, is a priest of Baal, the Canaanite god. And, well, if your dad's a priest of a god named Baal, it's safe to say you know a few things about worshiping him, right? So Ahab marries Jezebel, and of course, she brings all that Baal worship straight into the palace. You can already see the problem. Israel is getting pulled further into idolatry, and the nation is heading into some seriously dangerous spiritual territory. Now, here's where it gets interesting. This isn't just a story about bad kings and pagan marriages. The split in the kingdom, north and south, is crucial because it sets up a pattern. The kings of Israel, starting from the death of Solomon, are constantly compared to each other, and you see a back and forth of good and bad leadership. But Ahab, he's like the overachiever of evil, and marrying Jezebel only turbocharges the problem. Together, they introduce practices that go beyond the already shaky moral ground Israel was on. Idols, false prophets, worship of foreign gods, basically everything that's going to provoke God's judgment. And we're not talking a subtle warning here. This is full-on spiritual crisis mode. So, God's response? He raises up Elijah. And this is the first time we see him in the Bible. Which is wild because Elijah is going to become one of the most famous prophets in Israelite history. He's introduced with this one powerful sentence to Ahab. There will be no rain or dew except at my word. Just boom, like that. That's it. And this isn't a casual weather prediction. This is God's judgment being announced in a very real, very tangible way. Drought in the ancient world isn't just uncomfortable, it's devastating. Crops fail, livestock die, food disappears, and the economy collapses. So you can imagine the panic when the skies stay dry. And this whole drought is basically a divine wake-up call, aimed squarely at Ahab and the idolatry he's led his people into. But Elijah isn't some superhero who's going to fix everything instantly. He's just a guy like you and me, and God gives him step-by-step instructions. First, he confronts Ahab with the warning about the drought, and then he flees east to the brook of Kith. This is a safe place east of the Jordan River where God provides for him. And here's the part that's kind of mind-blowing. God uses ravens to feed him. Ravens. Birds. unclean birds. In fact, so already, we're seeing a pattern. God can use unexpected, even unconventional ways to provide. And yes, this is happening right in the middle of a drought that God himself has declared. It's like the universe is saying, I've got this, even if it looks impossible. Meanwhile, the northern kingdom under Ahab is spiraling. You have a king obsessed with power, a queen introducing foreign gods, and the people caught in the middle, uncertain who to follow. And the spiritual decay isn't just theoretical, it's real, it's measurable, and it's about to have consequences that affect everyone, from kings to farmers. And that's the genius of this story. You see, it's not just about Elijah performing miracles, it's about the stage being set so that the miraculous becomes necessary. You can't just pray, God, fix this drought. If the whole kingdom is spiritually bankrupt, the tension is real, and you can almost feel it building as Elijah gets ready to step onto the scene. But back to Ahab and Jezebel for a sec. This marriage isn't just a plot point, it's symbolic. Jezebel represents foreign influence, idolatry, and the temptation to follow human solutions instead of divine guidance. And Ahab, he's like the embodiment of choosing convenience over God's path. Instead of seeking God's face during the drought, he's worrying about feeding his livestock and protecting his palace. And that, right there, is the contrast that makes Elijah's story so compelling. One man obeys God step by step, even when it's scary or inconvenient, and the king, despite all the power at his disposal, fails to align with God's will. It's a reminder that position and influence don't equal spiritual insight or obedience. Another key piece here is the geography, which you've got to picture to really appreciate what's happening. Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, is where Ahab rules. Jerusalem in the south is Judah's capital. Sidon, home of Jezebel, is up on the coast of Lebanon. The split kingdoms, the rivers, the towns, these aren't just background scenery. They matter because God's instructions to Elijah involve travel, hiding, and miraculous provision in these specific locations. Every place he goes, every brook, every widow he meets is part of the setup for God's power to be revealed in a tangible, story-driven way. And here's a fun little detail the Bible throws in. Elijah is called a Tishbite, meaning he's from the town of Tishbe in Gilead, which, honestly, sounds like something out of a fantasy novel. Yeah, and the original narrator even makes a little joke. Good thing he's not from a town called Taubi, or he'd be a Tushbite. Light moments like this make the story more human and relatable, even amidst these heavy spiritual themes. Because yes, we're talking divine judgment, idolatry, and famine, but there's still room for a smile. So to sum up this historical backdrop before we dive deeper, the northern kingdom of Israel is divided from Judah, led by King Ahab, a notoriously wicked ruler. He marries Jezebel, a foreign princess and Baal worshiper, which deepens the nation's idolatry. God responds by sending Elijah, a prophet who will confront the king, declare a devastating drought, and demonstrate God's miraculous provision. The stage is set for an epic story of obedience, trust, and God's power. And every location, every character, and even every bird and brook plays a role in revealing the bigger picture. By understanding this context, you can see why everything Elijah does next is so dramatic, life-altering, and honestly kind of awe-inspiring. Alright, so now we get to Elijah's big entrance, and honestly, it's one of those moments where you just want to sit back and take it all in because this guy shows up and immediately makes things intense. He's not strolling in, waving hello, or handing out pamphlets. No. He's a prophet, and the first thing he does is deliver a message from God straight to King Ahab. And let me tell you, it's not a friendly weather forecast. He basically says, hey, the land's about to experience a serious drought. No rain. No dew. Nothing. Unless I say so. Just like that. Can you imagine being Ahab? The king, thinking he's in control, and this guy shows up and says the climate is about to change on God's orders. Yikes. So Elijah's introduction is kind of remarkable for a few reasons. First, he doesn't need a ton of words. One sentence, and the stage is set. He's called a Tishbite, meaning he's from a small town called Tishbe in Gilead. And you know, the narrator even throws in a little humor. Good thing he's not from a town called Taubi, or he'd be a Tushbite. Light joke aside, Elijah's presence is immediately commanding because he's not just speaking his own words. He literally stands as the representative of God in this moment. And that's a heavy weight for anyone to carry, right? He's just a man, but his words carry authority that even a king has to reckon with. Now, let's talk about the message. Drought in the ancient world was no small thing. It's not just, oh, the grass is dry. We're talking crops failing, livestock starving, people going hungry. It's a crisis on every level, and God's making it very clear that this is about his judgment. And why? Because of Ahab and the nation's idolatry. They've been flirting with Baal worship, letting Jezebel's influence take hold, and just generally ignoring God. This drought is like God saying, time to wake up, people, pay attention. But here's the interesting part. Elijah doesn't hang around for Ahab to throw a tantrum or try to kill him, which, let's be honest, the guy probably would. No. God immediately tells Elijah to get out of there. Head east, go to the brook of Kith, and hide. And I just love this because it's such a human moment. Elijah gives Ahab the hard truth, then turns around and obeys God's instructions. He doesn't argue, he doesn't panic, he just does what he's told. And that's our first lesson right there. When God gives you a task, obedience comes first, even if it's uncomfortable or confusing. So he heads to the brook of Kith. Now, we don't know exactly where this is, but it's east of the Jordan River, and it's not just a hiding spot, it's a place of provision. God tells Elijah he'll drink from the brook and, get this, that ravens will bring him food. Ravens, birds, and not exactly birds you'd think of as helpful in daily life. They're considered unclean animals, but God uses them. Every morning and every evening, they bring him bread and meat. And just pause for a second and picture this. You're in the middle of a drought. The land is dry. Food is scarce. And suddenly, a couple of ravens show up with your meals. It's miraculous and honestly, a little hilarious if you think about it. God's provision can come in ways we'd never expect, and he doesn't need to follow our ideas of normal. And Elijah drinks from the brook, eats the food from the ravens, and survives the drought's early days. But eventually, the brook dries up because, well, no rain. And here's another lesson. God provides, but sometimes in a way that teaches us dependence. Elijah has to rely entirely on God for his next steps. He's not hoarding, he's not panicking, he's just trusting. And it's not like he knows what's next. God hasn't given him a roadmap for the next 3 years. All he knows is, go east, trust me, I'll provide. That's a huge lesson for us. Faith isn't knowing the whole plan. Faith is being obedient to the part God shows you today. The story also shows something else about timing. God doesn't dump the whole mission on Elijah at once. One task at a time. First, speak to Ahab. Then, hide by the brook. Later. Move on to another assignment. Now, and it's like God is training him. Teaching patience, trust, and complete dependence. Elijah can't control anything except obedience in the moment. It's a slow reveal of God's plan, which, honestly, makes a lot of sense. If God showed us everything at once, we'd probably freak out. And while Elijah is by the brook, living off ravens and fresh water, there's this beautiful metaphor in play. Seasons of drought in our own lives. Sometimes we face dry periods spiritually, emotionally, or even physically. And just like Elijah, we can learn to rely fully on God during these times. He provides exactly what we need, in the exact way we need it, even if it's unexpected or a little awkward. Like birds dropping food on your porch. The brook and the ravens symbolize God's intimate care. He notices, he provides, and he teaches trust. There's also a subtle human element here. Elijah could have been tempted to complain, to wish he had better food, or to wonder if he made the right choice. But the narrative doesn't dwell on that. He trusts God. He takes the food, drinks the water, and survives. And that's huge. It's easy to read this and think, yeah, That's Elijah, superhuman. But the story emphasizes that he's human, just like the rest of us. He's dependent on God, not just powerful on his own. And that makes the miracle even more relatable. We can see ourselves in him, doing our best, obeying God, trusting in the small provisions he gives while waiting for the bigger picture to unfold. And, okay, another fun point that kind of cracks me up. God's choice of ravens. I mean, think about it. Unclean animals, by the rules of the time, literally considered not suitable for food. And yet, God uses them. He uses the unexpected, the overlooked, the seemingly unfit to provide, and the lesson there is obvious. Don't underestimate what God can do through the ordinary or the unlikely. If God can use a raven, he can use you. He can use anyone. That's a really encouraging idea when you're feeling small or insignificant. It's not about your status, your resources, or your experience. It's about obedience and faith. So as Elijah survives these early days of the drought, there are layers of lessons for us. First, obedience matters. He gives the hard truth to Ahab, and then he immediately obeys God's instructions. Second, dependence is key. He relies completely on God for water and food in a way that models faith in action. Third, God's provision often comes in unexpected ways. Ravens, streams, even seemingly unlikely people later on. Fourth, God gives us what we need for the moment, not necessarily the whole journey. And finally, human limitations don't stop God from doing incredible things. Elijah is just a man, yet through him, God's power is displayed. The drought is about to be a stage for divine intervention, and lessons for the nation and for us are being set up. And that's the beauty of this section of the story. It's not just history or geography or ancient drama. It's a masterclass in trust, obedience, and seeing God work through the ordinary and unexpected. Elijah's introduction as a prophet, his confrontation with Ahab, and his faithful obedience to God's instructions set the stage for miracles that go far beyond survival. They're lessons that stick with us because they're human, relatable, and, honestly, kind of inspiring. It's about seeing that even when the world seems dry, provision is possible. Even when the task seems impossible, faithfulness matters. And even when we feel small or ordinary, God can do extraordinary things through us if we're willing to follow and trust. Okay? So now we're getting into one of my favorite parts of this whole story, because it's where you really start to see God's power and provision in a way that feels, well, almost like a sneak peek at what's coming later with Jesus and the loaves and fishes. This is Elijah's journey to Zarephath, and it's a moment full of tension, wonder, and some serious human drama. So stick with me, because it's not just a story about a prophet walking to a town. It's about faith, fear, and the miraculous ways God works through the most unlikely people. After Elijah's time at the brook of Kith, which we already talked about, he's running out of water, and God gives him the next part of the mission: head north to Zarephath. Now, Zarephath isn't in Israel. It's actually in Sidon, the same region where Jezebel is from, up along the Mediterranean coast in modern-day Lebanon. And here's what makes this interesting. God is sending his prophet into enemy territory. This is foreign land, Gentile territory, and the woman he's about to meet has no prior relationship with God. So, right off the bat, there's tension. Elijah has been faithful, obedient, living by God's instructions, and now he's about to depend on someone completely unexpected to provide for him. So Elijah arrives at Zarephath, and he meets a widow gathering sticks. Picture this, it's a desperate time. The famine is in full swing, crops are failing, livestock are dying, and she's out there just trying to make a fire to cook the last bit of food she has for herself and her son. Her resources are basically nothing. The Bible describes her saying, "I have only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. I'm just gathering sticks so I can prepare it for myself and my son so that we may eat it and die." I mean, wow, that's the human reality of famine right there. She's scared, she's exhausted, and she's facing real death, not just discomfort. And then Elijah shows up and says, "Hey, can you get me a little water and something to eat?" I mean, talk about asking for the impossible. This woman has barely enough for herself, and now a stranger is asking her to share it. You can almost hear her thought process. I don't know if I can do this. I'm out of food. I'm just trying to survive." Her fear is completely understandable. But here's where the story gets beautiful. She listens. She doesn't say no. She doesn't argue. She recognizes that Elijah is a man of God, and there's this tiny spark of trust. Elijah encourages her. He says, "Don't be afraid. Go ahead and make a little bread for me first. Then make some for yourself and your son. This is what the Lord says. The bin of flour will not be used up, and the jar of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." And just pause here for a second. Can you imagine being her? You've got maybe enough flour for one meal, a little oil, and a stranger tells you, "Trust me, this will last." That's counterintuitive. That's faith in the face of impossibility. And that's exactly what God is teaching both of them in this moment. Elijah learns to depend fully on God, and the widow learns to step out in faith, even when it seems irrational by all human standards. So she goes ahead and does it. She makes the bread, and guess what? The flour and oil don't run out. Day after day, meal after meal, they keep having enough to eat. It's miraculous. This is God providing, not through the rich or the powerful, but through a destitute widow. And that's a theme that runs throughout Scripture. God can use anyone to accomplish his purposes, even people who feel small, overlooked, or powerless. He's not limited by resources or human expectations. He multiplies what's available for his glory, and in doing so, he teaches a profound lesson about trust, obedience, and dependence. And you know what's even more remarkable? The story foreshadows the miracle of the loaves and fishes in the New Testament. Jesus feeds thousands with just a few loaves and fishes. And here we have a widow with a handful of flour and a little oil sustaining a prophet through a famine. God's pattern is consistent. He can take what seems insignificant, what seems insufficient, and make it more than enough. It's a reminder that when God is in control, scarcity becomes abundance, and what's impossible for humans becomes possible through divine intervention. Let's also talk about the human reactions here because they make the story come alive. Elijah's approach is calm, confident, and trusting. He's not panicking. He's been through the drought at the brook. He's seen God provide with ravens, and now he's stepping into a new situation with the same trust. And the widow, she's scared, she's hesitant, she's facing the potential loss of her last food supply. But she listens, she obeys, and the miracle happens. There's this back and forth of faith and action that's incredibly relatable. We can see ourselves in both characters, the one called to trust and the one called to act in faith despite fear. Another point to notice is how ordinary this scene feels. There are no fireworks, no booming voice from heaven, at least not yet, no dramatic signs. It's simple, flour, oil, and daily obedience. And yet, it's miraculous. It's a reminder that God often works in ordinary moments through ordinary people. And that the miraculous isn't always about spectacle, it's about transformation, provision, and faithfulness. Sometimes the most extraordinary things happen quietly, day by day, as people take small steps in trust. And the widow's participation is key here. She could have said no. She could have hoarded what little she had. She could have let fear control her. Instead, she steps out in faith. She becomes an unlikely vessel through which God provides for his prophet. And this teaches us a big lesson about humility and service. God can use anyone, and he often chooses people who feel least capable to display his power. Her willingness to give, even when she has almost nothing, allows God to work a miracle through her. That's profound because it shifts the focus from human ability to divine ability. God doesn't need us to be rich, powerful, or perfect. He just needs obedience and faith. Now, the multiplication of the flour and oil is also a really cool detail because it's ongoing. This isn't just a one-time miracle where suddenly there's enough for one meal. The story emphasizes that the provisions last until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. That's weeks, maybe months, depending on the length of the drought. Every day they eat. They are reminded of God's faithfulness and abundance. Every day, the widow pours out what little she has. She experiences God's power sustaining her. And Elijah, watching all this, is learning to trust God step by step. He doesn't know the whole plan, but he's faithful with what God gives today. That's such a practical lesson for us. We don't need to have all the answers or control over the future. God's provision is sufficient for the moment we're in, and the vividness of this scene is hard to overstate. Picture it, a small, humble kitchen in a foreign town. The widow gathering sticks, a little boy nearby, Elijah arriving, asking for food, her hesitating, then obeying. Day after day, the flour doesn't run out, the oil keeps flowing, and life continues despite the famine raging outside. It's the kind of scene that makes you pause and say, whoa, God is really at work here. And it's relatable, too, because who hasn't faced moments of scarcity or fear? Moments where we had to step out and trust God, even though it didn't make sense. There's also this ongoing theme of learning dependence on God. Elijah has already experienced provision through the ravens at the brook, but now he sees it through human hands. God is teaching him different ways to trust, first through animals, then through people. And the widow, completely unaware of the larger divine plan, is participating in a miracle simply by being obedient. Both are learning that God's provision doesn't always look the way we expect, but it's always sufficient. And this dynamic between obedience, trust, and unexpected provision is a powerful reminder for us today. We often wait for God to show up in dramatic ways, but sometimes the most miraculous things happen through small, seemingly ordinary actions. And let's talk a little bit about fear and courage, because this is so human. And the widow is terrified. She literally thinks she and her son might die. Her fear is completely justified, but Elijah doesn't dismiss her fear. He acknowledges it by encouraging her. He doesn't lecture her about faith or tell her to just believe harder. He points her to God's promise and instructs her on the next step. That's how faith grows, through small, tangible actions and encouragement in the midst of fear. And her courage, even though shaky, allows God to perform a miracle. Sometimes faith isn't a giant leap, it's a series of small steps, and each step becomes an opportunity for God to show his power. And here's the kicker. This story is a perfect setup for what we see later with Jesus and the loaves and fishes. A tiny amount becomes enough for many. A handful of flour and a little oil sustains a household during a famine. A few loaves and fishes feed thousands. God has a pattern, and it's about taking what seems small or insufficient and multiplying it to meet needs. It's a lesson in trust, in reliance on God's power rather than our own, and in being willing to be a conduit for God's provision, even when we feel inadequate. So, when we step back and look at the story of Elijah and the widow in Zarephath, it's rich with lessons. It's about God using unlikely sources. It's about human fear and divine encouragement. It's about daily obedience and faithfulness. It's about seeing God's hand in the ordinary, mundane, and seemingly insufficient. And it's about recognizing that God's ways are often counterintuitive. What seems impossible to us is routine for him. The widow's obedience, Elijah's trust, and God's miraculous provision all work together to show a story that's vivid, relatable, and awe-inspiring. It reminds us that miracles can come in small packages, and that God often chooses the most unexpected ways and people to display his power, and the human element keeps it relatable. The widow's hesitation, her fear, her conversation with Elijah, it's real. Elijah's calm obedience, his reliance on God's direction, his experience at the brook, it's all human and believable. We can picture ourselves in their shoes, feeling the fear, stepping out in faith, and then watching as God provides in ways we never expected. That's what makes this story timeless. It's not just a historical account, it's a living example of trust, obedience, and God's miraculous power in action. Lessons that continue to speak to us today. Alright, now we get to one of the most intense and emotional parts of Elijah's story, the moment with the widow's son. And honestly, it's a part that really hits you in the gut because it's raw, it's human, and it's miraculous all at once. So picture this. Elijah has been staying with the widow in Zarephath. She's been faithfully providing for him, and God has been sustaining them both with that miraculous flour and oil. Life is going on day by day, even amidst the famine. But then tragedy strikes. Her son becomes seriously ill, so sick that there's no breath left in him. It's sudden, it's devastating, and you can imagine the widow's panic. She's alone, her husband is already gone, and she's been relying on this small amount of provision just to survive. Now her only child is on the brink of death, and she turns to Elijah, this prophet who's become part of her daily life, and says something heartbreaking. "What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" There's so much packed into that statement. She's scared, she's grieving, and she's struggling to understand why this tragedy is happening. And notice how she immediately associates the boy's death with her own sin. That's a natural human reaction, right? When bad things happen, we instinctively look for someone to blame, and sometimes that someone is ourselves. And it's so relatable because, in moments of crisis, fear and guilt are often tangled together. Elijah's response here is deeply human as well. He doesn't respond with a lecture. He doesn't dismiss her fears. He takes the boy in his arms and goes up to an upper room. Now, in those days, the upper room or the roof area was often a living space, sometimes extended for guests. And this is where Elijah lays the boy on his own bed. You can almost see him pacing, holding the boy, praying, trying to figure out what to do. The text says that he stretched himself over the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's soul come back to him." Pause for a moment and think about this. Elijah has never done anything like this before. No one in scripture has modeled raising someone from the dead at this point. He doesn't have a formula. He doesn't have a step-by-step guide. He's just a man, desperate and faithful, pleading with God. There's uncertainty, there's fear, there's hope, and there's an enormous amount of trust packed into those prayers. And that's something that makes the story feel so human. Elijah is relatable. He's not performing magic. He's doing the only thing he knows to do, turning to God completely, putting everything in his hands. The widow watches this unfold, and you can imagine the emotional roller coaster she must have been on. First, despair and fear, thinking her son has died. Then, maybe a glimmer of hope, seeing Elijah's faith and determination. And finally, awe and relief as the miracle happens. The Bible says the Lord heard Elijah's prayer, and the boy's soul returned to him. He revives. He breathes again. Life comes back. Imagine that moment. The shock, the tears, the relief. That's a profound miracle, yes, but it's also deeply human because we can relate to fear, hope, and astonishment all at once. And there's a beautiful human element here in Elijah's response. The text shows that he's not distant or detached. He's emotionally invested. He grieves with the widow. He intercedes with fervent prayer, and he experiences the weight of the miracle just as intensely as she does. This isn't a story of a cold, supernatural act. It's a story of God working through a man who feels, who cares, and who trusts. And that makes the miracle even more incredible because it's intertwined with human emotion, faith, and devotion. When the miracle is complete, Elijah takes the boy back down to the house and gives him to his mother. And the widow's reaction is priceless and poignant. She says, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." There's so much packed into that simple statement. She's acknowledging God's power, Elijah's faithfulness, and the reality that divine intervention just occurred. Her recognition is born out of personal experience, the kind of proof that moves faith from theory to reality. And notice that it's not just about the miracle itself. It's about the trust, obedience, and courage that both she and Elijah displayed leading up to it. That's the full lesson here. God's power is revealed when human hearts respond with faith, even in impossible circumstances. And let's take a moment to reflect on the gravity of this miracle. This is the first time in scripture that someone is brought back from the dead in this way. That's huge. And yet, the story handles it with a naturalness that emphasizes the human side of everything. There's fear, grief, hope, prayer, and awe. The narrative doesn't turn into a spectacle, it stays grounded in the human experience, which makes the miracle all the more powerful. We can picture it in our minds, we can imagine the emotions, and we can relate to the vulnerability and dependence on God that both Elijah and the widow display. Now, there's also a deeper spiritual lesson in the way this unfolds. Notice how God uses Elijah, a man just like us, to perform this extraordinary act. The power doesn't come from Elijah himself. It comes from God. Elijah's role is obedience, faith, and intercession. He's the vessel through which God works. That's a huge takeaway because it shows that God can do incredible things through ordinary to human means. We often underestimate the impact we can have simply because we think we're not equipped or powerful enough. But Elijah's example shows that faithfulness, obedience, and a heart tuned to God are enough for him to work miracles. And the widow's role is also important. She participates by allowing Elijah into her home, by trusting him, and by extension, God. Her fear is real, but her willingness to step out of her comfort zone and place herself in God's hands enables the miracle. It's a reminder that God often works through collaboration between the divine and human action. Faith doesn't happen in isolation. It's a partnership, a conversation, a shared journey between God and those willing to obey. The story also brings up themes of grief and trust that are incredibly relatable. How often do we face situations that seem hopeless? Moments where we feel powerless, where fear and despair threaten to overwhelm us. The widow's reaction is natural. She fears, she questions, she struggles to make sense of what's happening. And yet, through Elijah's intercession and her eventual trust, God turns tragedy into restoration. That dynamic is present in our own lives, too. We may not witness literal resurrection, but we experience moments where God brings hope, renewal, and provision in situations that feel impossible. And the miracle itself is astonishing in its simplicity and intimacy. It's not a grand public display with thousands of witnesses. It's a quiet, personal restoration of life. That makes it relatable and profound. We don't need grand spectacles to experience God's power. Sometimes the most significant miracles are those that touch our hearts directly, in our homes, in our families, in the private moments where faith, fear, and hope intersect. Another aspect to notice is how Elijah handles the situation with care and reverence. He doesn't rush, he doesn't act arrogantly, he prays persistently. Stretching himself over the boy 3 times isn't a magical formula. It's a sign of deep engagement, commitment, and earnest prayer. It shows us that God honors persistent, heartfelt intercession. Elijah's actions remind us that in moments of crisis, we don't need to panic or pretend we have all the answers. Prayer, faith, and reliance on God's power are the way forward. And then, there's the emotional resonance. Imagine the widow's grief transforming into relief, joy, and renewed faith in the span of what must have felt like hours. Imagine Elijah's own emotional journey. He prays, he waits, he intercedes, and he witnesses God's response. This is a story that emphasizes human emotion as much as divine power. It's a reminder that faith isn't devoid of feeling. It's lived and experienced, with all the highs and lows of human emotion. The miracle also sets the stage for future events, showing that God's power is active, intentional, and responsive. Just as he provided daily sustenance through the flour and oil, he restores life when the situation seems completely hopeless. There's a consistent pattern. God meets needs, demonstrates power, and teaches lessons through the most ordinary and ordinary seeming elements of life. And it's all tied together through faith, obedience, and intercession. Finally, there's a takeaway here that's both comforting and challenging. It's comforting because it shows that God listens, God acts, and He is intimately involved in human lives. It's challenging because it reminds us that faith often requires us to step into uncertainty, to trust when outcomes seem impossible, and to persist in prayer and obedience. The widow had no idea how the situation would resolve, yet she trusted. Elijah had no model for raising someone from the dead, yet he acted in faith and prayer, and God showed up in a miraculous way that was both awe-inspiring and deeply personal. So when we reflect on this story, The emotions, the fear, the grief, the hope, and the joy are all human, but the power behind the miracle is divine. Elijah's faithful obedience, the widow's trust, and God's miraculous provision come together in a story that is vivid, relatable, and transformational. It's a story that resonates because it shows that even in our darkest moments, God can restore, provide, and perform wonders in ways that are beyond human comprehension, yet intimately connected to our human experience. It's a reminder that faith, trust, and obedience, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, can be the conduit for God's miraculous work in our lives. Alright, now we're getting to the epic showdown, the part that really makes Elijah's story come alive and has you on the edge of your seat. This is the confrontation between Elijah and King Ahab, the gathering on Mount Carmel, and the incredible contest against 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. And trust me, this isn't just a battle of brute strength or political maneuvering. It's spiritual tension, human emotion, and awe-inspiring divine power all rolled into one dramatic scene. So, picture the setup. It's been years of drought. The land is dry. Crops have failed. People are hungry and yeet. And the northern kingdom of Israel is in chaos, spiritually and physically. Ahab, the king, has been running around trying to manage the crisis. But the real problem isn't just the famine, it's the idolatry he's allowed to flourish. Baal and Asherah have been worshipped openly, and Jezebel has been eliminating the prophets of the Lord. Meanwhile, Elijah has been patiently waiting for the right time to confront this head on. And now, the Lord tells him it's time to act. This is the moment where everything comes to a head. Elijah presents himself to Ahab, and the tension is immediately palpable. Ahab sees him and says, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Notice the disdain in that statement. He doesn't recognize the truth. He sees Elijah as a problem, someone stirring things up. And here's a key point. Human reaction to God's message often depends on our own spiritual state. Obadiah, the king's servant, reacts with respect and awe because he fears God. Ahab reacts with disdain because he's not walking with God. That contrast is striking because it sets the tone for the confrontation. How we respond to truth often reveals what's in our hearts. Elijah doesn't back down. He answers firmly, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals." Boom. He's calling out the problem clearly, directly, and without apology. And then he challenges Ahab to gather the people on Mount Carmel and bring together all 850 prophets, the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. That's a massive assembly, a full-on spiritual showdown. Imagine the scene, hundreds of people, a king, prophets on both sides, all on this mountain that overlooks the Jezreel Valley. The stakes are high, the tension is thick, and everyone's waiting to see what's about to happen. Elijah steps up to the crowd and delivers one of the most powerful questions in Scripture. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. Pause for a second and imagine the weight of that statement. He's not asking lightly. This is a challenge to their hearts, their faith, and their choices. And the crowd? They're speechless. No one has an answer. That's how deep the crisis has gone. People are torn, confused, and stuck in spiritual indecision. And here's a human truth. Sometimes, when confronted with choice and clarity, we freeze. The silence says it all. Then Elijah makes the next move. He knows he's effectively alone in standing for God. At least that's how it feels to him. And he sets the stage for the contest. The prophets of Baal are told to prepare their altar, and Elijah will prepare the Lord's altar. The rules are simple yet dramatic. Each side lays their bull on the wood, but no fire is put under it. They will call on their God, and the God who answers by fire is the true God. Simple concept, but incredibly suspenseful. Imagine the nerves of the prophets, the anticipation of the crowd, and the quiet tension in the air. You can almost hear the wind, the waiting, the hearts pounding. The prophets of Baal go first. They cry out to their God from morning till noon, shouting, dancing, even cutting themselves with knives and lances, following their ritual to provoke a response. But nothing happens. No fire, no answer, no sign. The intensity builds. By midday, they are exhausted, frustrated, desperate, and then Elijah steps in, and this is where his confidence and presence really shine. He mocks them, not cruelly, but pointedly, highlighting the absurdity of worshiping a God who can't respond. He says things like, cry louder, maybe he's meditating, maybe he's on a journey, maybe he's sleeping and needs to be awakened. You can almost hear the crowd chuckling nervously at the irony, realizing how powerless these prophets truly are. It's a human, almost humorous moment amid serious tension. Then it's Elijah's turn. He repairs the altar of the Lord, which had been broken down, and selects 12 stones, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Every action is deliberate, symbolic, and meaningful. He lays the wood, places the bull on the altar, and then he does something that seems almost impossible. He commands that 4 jars of water be poured over the sacrifice, and then he repeats it 2 more times, saturating the altar and filling the trench around it with water. This is critical because it eliminates any chance that the fire could appear naturally. The miracle will be unmistakable, and you can picture the human reactions here: curiosity, suspense, maybe even doubt creeping in. Everyone knows Elijah is serious, but can this actually happen? And then it happens. At the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah prays, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. Hear me, Lord, that this people may know that you are the Lord. His prayer is short but powerful, focused, and full of confidence in God's character and promises. And then, boom, fire falls from heaven. It consumes the burnt sacrifice, the wood, the stones, even the dust, and it licks up the water in the trench. Can you imagine the human reaction? Awe, shock, fear, wonder, all at once. People fall on their faces exclaiming, the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. This is a moment of collective revelation, a spiritual epiphany witnessed by everyone present. And here's the thing that really stands out. God's glory is displayed against all odds. The altar is drenched, the sacrifice is soaked, yet fire from heaven consumes everything. It's dramatic, unmistakable, and awe-inspiring. Elijah's preparation, the challenge, the mockery of the prophets of Baal. It all leads to this climactic moment. And it's not just spectacle, it's a teaching moment. God shows His power, exposes false gods, and demonstrates that faithfulness and obedience to Him lead to undeniable results. And then there's the aftermath. Elijah seizes the prophets of Baal, ensuring that the idolatry is confronted decisively. Ahab goes to eat and drink, hearing the sound of abundance, while Elijah ascends Mount Carmel to pray for rain, seeking the Lord earnestly. The human reactions here are layered. Ahab witnesses God's power, but doesn't fully grasp the significance spiritually. The people are awed and repentant. Elijah is focused, prayerful, and deeply engaged with God. It's a complex human tapestry of fear, awe, joy, and reverence. This story is also packed with lessons about tension, anticipation, and human responses to divine intervention. The crowd is involved. The false prophets are exposed. The king is confronted, and Elijah acts with calm, confident obedience. Human emotion is palpable throughout: fear, doubt, awe, anticipation, and ultimately, recognition of God's power. And it's told in a way that makes it vivid, relatable, and dramatic without ever feeling like a lecture. You can picture the mountain, the crowd, the soaked altar, the fire falling, the collective gasp of the people, and the deep sense of awe that must have settled over everyone. The dynamic between human action and divine power is also central here. Elijah obeys, prepares meticulously, prays fervently, and God responds with undeniable supernatural force. The prophets of Baal act in frenzy, desperation, and ritual, but their God cannot respond. The crowd witnesses this contrast firsthand. It's a masterclass in showing how obedience, faith, and divine authority intersect in moments of extreme tension. And let's not forget the humor and human touch. Elijah's mockery of Baal's prophets adds a relatable layer to the story. It reminds us that even in serious, high-stakes spiritual moments, there's room for human perspective, wit, and clarity. He exposes the folly of idolatry in a way that makes the truth impossible to ignore. And the crowd reacts, not just with awe, but with recognition of the absurdity of worshiping gods that cannot answer. It's a moment of revelation, teaching, and dramatic effect all at once. Mount Carmel itself adds to the drama. It's not just a backdrop, it's a strategic and symbolic location. Overlooking the Jezreel Valley, the mountain becomes a stage where the spiritual battle between the Lord and the Baal Asherah prophets is played out. The geography enhances the tension, allowing the crowd to witness the miraculous event from a distance while feeling the immediate presence of God's power. The mountain, the valley, the soaked altar, the assembled people, and the miraculous fire all create a scene of unparalleled drama and awe. And the theological lessons are huge. God's glory is displayed, false worship is exposed, faithfulness is rewarded, and obedience is validated. Elijah's actions demonstrate human responsibility, preparing the altar, calling the people, challenging the prophets, while God demonstrates his power. It's a dynamic interplay between human agency and divine authority, and it's narrated in a way that keeps the tension high and the audience engaged. You can almost feel the anticipation in the crowd, the nervous energy of the prophets, and the calm, confident focus of Elijah. Finally, the story leaves a lasting impression because it's so human and vivid. The fear, awe, mockery, prayer, and ultimate miraculous fire all combine to create a scene that resonates across centuries. It shows that divine power works through human obedience, that God's glory can be displayed in dramatic and undeniable ways, and that faithfulness, even against overwhelming odds, leads to profound results. The Mount Carmel showdown is epic, not just because of the fire from heaven, but because it captures the full spectrum of human emotion, tension, and awe in the presence of God's miraculous power. It's a story that grabs attention, inspires faith, and leaves you reflecting on what it means to stand for God with courage, obedience, and trust. Alright, now we're at the conclusion of the drought story, and this is where Elijah's prayers really come to the forefront. After the incredible showdown on Mount Carmel, where God's fire proved his supremacy over Baal and Asherah, the land is still in desperate need of rain. The sky has been dry for 3.5 years, crops have withered, livestock have suffered, and the people are still living in the aftermath of the famine. So now, it's time for Elijah to pray for the rain, and this part of the story gives us such a rich example of persistence, faith, and human reliance on God. Elijah climbs to the top of Mount Carmel once again, and I just love picturing this moment. After the dramatic events with the false prophets, he's alone, kneeling on the ground, and we're told he puts his face between his knees as he prays. Pause and picture that. He's fully focused, completely dependent on God, and fully aware of the enormity of the situation. The drought has been long, the land has suffered, and the people are counting on God's mercy. Elijah's posture tells us everything. This isn't casual prayer. This isn't a quick, half-hearted ask. He is fully engaged, fully human, and fully reliant on the Lord. And here's the part that's really amazing. Elijah doesn't just pray once. He sends his servant to look toward the sea repeatedly, 7 times. The servant goes to check for a sign, and each time he reports back, nothing. Can you imagine the tension? 7 times. Nothing seems to happen. I mean, I don't know about you, but after the first few times, I might have started to feel a little discouraged, maybe even questioned if God heard me. But Elijah stays patient and persistent. This is one of those lessons about prayer that really hits home. Sometimes God answers immediately. Sometimes it requires endurance and trust. Faith isn't just a one-off thing. It's sticking with God even when the outcome isn't visible yet. And then, on the 7th time, the servant sees a small cloud, just as small as a man's hand, rising from the sea. That tiny cloud, barely noticeable, is the first sign of the coming rain. It's a subtle, almost understated miracle, and yet it's enough to signal that God is answering. It's like the first whisper of hope after a long, barren season. And from there, The sky quickly becomes black with clouds. Wind picks up, and a heavy rain begins to fall. The drought is over. The land, the people, and the livestock can finally begin to recover. And the timing of it all, after such a long period of prayer and dependence, emphasizes the power of perseverance and trust in God. This is such a warm, encouraging example of prayer because it's not about mysticism or dramatic formula. Elijah is human. He's exhausted. He's aware of the suffering around him, and he's had to wait. And yet, his prayers are effective because they are earnest, persistent, and aligned with God's will. This story ties beautifully into James 5:16, which reminds us, the effective, fervent prayer of a righteous person avails much. That's exactly what we see with Elijah. He's human like us, facing impossible circumstances, yet when he prays faithfully and persistently, God acts in extraordinary ways. It's a reminder that we don't need to be superhuman to have our prayers answered. Our faithfulness, our honesty, and our persistence matter. And here's another aspect that makes this story relatable: the patience required in prayer. Those 7 trips of the servant aren't just a narrative device, they're a teaching moment. Often, we pray and we want instant results, but Elijah shows us that God's timing is perfect. We might only see a tiny sign, like the small cloud, before the full blessing comes. And even in that waiting, we're called to remain faithful, to continue in prayer, and to trust that God is at work behind the scenes, even when we don't see it yet. It's comforting and challenging at the same time. It reminds us that prayer isn't about rushing God, it's about joining Him in His work, patiently and persistently. The visual imagery here is also incredible. Imagine Mount Carmel, the clouds forming, wind rising, and finally, the rain hitting the dry earth. This is not just a physical restoration, but a spiritual one as well. The land has suffered because the people have strayed. The famine has been a sign of judgment, and now the rain symbolizes God's mercy and restoration. It's a perfect combination of the human and divine working together. Elijah's obedience, prayer, and faith intersect with God's miraculous power, bringing tangible results. And the awe that must have swept over the people, watching the sky darken and the rain fall after years of dryness, reinforces the importance of trusting in God's timing and plan. And we also see how prayer is relational in this story. Elijah isn't just talking into the air, he's in dialogue with God. His posture, his persistence, and his focus show a deeply personal engagement with the Lord. He's fully invested in what he's praying for, aware of the suffering around him, and actively participating in God's plan. That's what makes this narrative so relatable for us today. Our prayers don't have to be dramatic or perfectly worded. They need to come from a heart that is engaged, persistent, and trusting. Just like Elijah, our human efforts, joined with God's divine action, can result in incredible outcomes. There's also a broader lesson here about obedience and faith. Elijah's prayer is effective because it comes from a life of obedience. He's been faithful through the drought, through the miraculous provision at Zarephath, through the confrontation with Ahab and the false prophets. His prayers are not just words, they are the outpouring of a life that has consistently trusted and obeyed God. That's an important reminder. The effectiveness of prayer is deeply connected to a lifestyle of faithfulness and obedience. God honors consistent faith, not just isolated acts of prayer. And it's worth pausing to reflect on the human reactions here. The people who witnessed the fire on Mount Carmel, the exposure of the false prophets, and now the coming of rain must have been awestruck. There's joy, relief, and probably a deep sense of humility as they realize the power of the God of Israel compared to the impotent Baal. And Elijah, fully human, shares in the anticipation, the excitement, and the tension. His prayers are fervent because he cares, and his heart is aligned with God's purposes. This is a story that shows that human emotion and divine power coexist in beautiful, powerful ways. James 5:16 really ties all of this together for us. It reminds us that the prayer of a righteous person avails much, and that's exactly what we see here. Elijah is righteous, faithful, and persistent, and his prayers have a direct, tangible impact on the world around him. It's encouraging because it reminds us that prayer is not passive. It's not a ritual for the sake of ritual. It's an active, relational, and powerful force when combined with faith, obedience, and alignment with God's will. And the fact that Elijah is human like us reinforces the point. We don't need to be superhuman to see God work through our prayers. Fervent, consistent, faithful prayer matters, and the way the rain finally comes is also instructive. The small cloud represents the first visible sign. Subtle and almost insignificant, yet it is enough to confirm that God is at work. Then the sky darkens, the wind picks up, and the rain pours down. That sequence teaches us patience and attentiveness in prayer. God may answer in small, seemingly minor ways first, and we need to recognize and respond to those signs with gratitude and trust. The initial small cloud reminds us that God's answers may start quietly, but they will grow and manifest fully according to His plan. And let's reflect on how relatable this is. Sometimes we face situations that seem hopeless, situations where we feel like God is silent. We pray, we hope, and we wait, and maybe nothing happens for a while, or what happens is subtle and easy to overlook. Elijah's example shows us how to persevere, how to remain focused, and how to trust that God is working, even if the full result isn't immediate. His human patience, persistence, and faith give us a template for our own prayer life. It's encouraging because it shows that God honors our dedication, our faith, and our persistence, even when we are human, flawed, and limited. And the final lesson here is about awe and gratitude. When the rain comes, it's not just a practical solution to the drought, it's a display of God's glory, power, and faithfulness. It's a visual and tangible reminder that God hears, God acts, and God restores, and for us, that's a powerful encouragement. Our prayers, when aligned with God's will and offered with faith, can have profound effects. The story of Elijah and the end of the drought reminds us to pray big, to persist in faith, and to trust that God's timing is perfect, even when we don't see the full answer immediately. So as we reflect on this story, the human and divine elements are deeply intertwined. Elijah is fully human, fully emotional, fully dependent on God. He prays with fervor, persistence, and obedience. God responds in a dramatic, awe-inspiring, and undeniable way. And the lessons for us are clear. Our prayers matter. God honors faithfulness. Persistence in prayer is vital, and even the smallest signs of God at work are meaningful. James 5:16 reminds us that prayer avails much, and Elijah's story brings that verse to life. He wasn't a superhero, he was human like us, and yet, through his prayers, the heavens opened and the earth was restored. That's a reminder that our prayers, offered with faith and obedience, are powerful, meaningful, and effective. It's a warm, encouraging, and deeply relatable lesson that continues to resonate today. So, to wrap this up, Elijah's story is a wild ride of faith, obedience, and trust in God, even when situations seem impossible. From the drought to Mount Carmel, from the widow's miracle to raising her son, it all shows that God works through ordinary people who simply obey and believe. And hey, if this story inspired you or gave you a fresh perspective on faith and prayer, make sure to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss more amazing stories like this. Crazy, right?